The military kennel went silent the moment she walked through the gate. 18 Belgian Malinois, each one trained to bite through body armor, each one capable of taking down a grown man in 4 seconds, turned their heads in the same direction at the same instant, not toward a threat, toward her. Sergeant Dax Corvell had been handling combat K9s for 11 years. He had never seen anything like it. The new civilian nurse, visitor badge clipped to her scrubs, medical folder tucked under one arm, stopped 3 feet from Argo, the most aggressive dog in the entire unit, and the animal simply stopped snarling. She said one word. The dog sat down like he'd been waiting his whole life to hear it. And nobody in that yard knew the woman they were already dismissing had written the manual every single one of them trained from. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay right here until the end, because what happens next will leave you completely stunned. Hit like, subscribe, so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. The morning Fenna Walgrave drove through the gates of Harwick Military Installation. The fog was still sitting low over the training fields, and the guard at the checkpoint barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. That was the first mistake people made with Fenna. They looked at the visitor badge, the civilian scrubs, the absence of rank insignia, and they filed her into a category that had nothing to do with who she actually was. She had gotten used to it. The drive from the parking lot to the medical complex took 4 minutes, and she used every one of them to go over what she already knew about Iron Ridge K9 program, which was technically what the unit called itself, even though it operated under the Harwick Installation umbrella. The briefing from the Military Justice Review Office had been thorough. 14 dogs removed from active service in 11 months. 3 biting incidents involving handlers. 1 dog labeled unrecoverable and scheduled for euthanasia within 72 hours. An official report from the unit's commander that blamed the animals. Fenna had read that report twice on the drive up from Calder City. By the second read, she already knew the animals weren't the problem. She parked in the visitor lot outside the medical center, grabbed her folder, and sat for a moment looking at the low concrete building that housed the K9 Medical and Recovery Wing. There was a training yard visible behind a chain-link fence 200 meters to the left. Even from the car, she could hear the dogs. Not chaos, not aggression, just that specific quality of restless energy that working K9s carried when they hadn't been run properly. She got out of the car. The intake desk inside the medical center was staffed by a young corporal named Hassel, who looked at her visitor badge, then at his screen, then back at her with the particular expression of someone who has found an unexpected item in the wrong column of a spreadsheet. "Ms. Walgrave," he said carefully, "you're here as a civilian medical consultant. That's correct? And the reviewing office sent you specifically?" They did. Hassel typed something, looked at his screen again. "I'll need to reach out to Colonel Valen's office to confirm your access level." "That's fine," Fenna said. She sat down in one of the waiting chairs and opened her folder. She wasn't in a hurry. The dogs weren't going anywhere in the next 20 minutes, and neither was the evidence she'd already started mapping before she left home. The call to Colonel Valen's office apparently went somewhere unexpected, because Hassel spent 9 minutes on the phone before hanging up and printing a temporary access card with slightly more authority than what he'd originally been given clearance to issue. Fenna noticed the small upgrade and said nothing about it. She clipped the new card over the old one and went to find the kennels. The training yard smelled like damp concrete, worked leather, and the particular nervous chemical edge of animals that were fit, alert, and not entirely at peace. Fenna stood at the gate for a moment, reading the yard the same way she'd learned to read an emergency room, who was moving too fast, who was compensating, what the energy underneath the visible surface was actually telling her. There were 6 handlers working dogs in the yard. 4 were running standard obstacle drills with K9s on lead. 1 was working bite sleeve training at the far end. The 6th, a solidly built sergeant with the kind of deliberate posture that announced itself before the man even opened his mouth, was standing near the kennel entrance watching her. He walked over before she reached the gate. "Civilian access doesn't cover the active training yard," he said. It wasn't quite a greeting. Fenna held up her access card. "Fenna Walgrave, Military Justice Review Office, Medical Consultant. I have yard access for the duration of my evaluation." The sergeant looked at the card long enough to make the point that he was deciding whether to honor it, not simply reading it. "Sergeant Dax Corvell," he said finally. "I'm second senior handler here, and I'll tell you what I tell every paper pusher they send through. These dogs aren't a paperwork problem." "I haven't suggested they are." "The last two consultants tried to interview the handlers like we were the issue." "Were you?" That landed differently than he expected. Corvell studied her. He was somewhere around 40, weathered in the specific way that came from years of outdoor work rather than hard living, and his eyes were the kind that cataloged and stored information without advertising the process. "What kind of medical consultant looks at dog training records?" he asked. "The kind who noticed that your removal rate tripled 8 months after you changed lead trainers," Fenna said evenly. "I'd like to start with the recovery logs, specifically the ones for the dogs that were labeled aggressive." Corvell held her gaze for a moment, then stepped aside to let her through the gate. She walked into the yard and the dogs noticed her immediately. Not all at once. It wasn't a movie moment. Not at first. It was more subtle than that. The nearest K9, a dark-coated Malinois working a retrieve drill, interrupted his retrieve and turned his head toward her with his ears up and his body still. His handler tugged the lead and the dog came back to the drill, but his attention kept drifting. Then the second dog did the same thing. Fenna kept walking toward the kennel entrance, not looking directly at any of them, keeping her pace even and unhurried. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had spent 6 years learning it. Corvell was watching her. She could feel it. She didn't explain herself. She just walked. The K9 records room was a narrow space off the main kennel corridor that smelled like printer ink and dog and industrial cleaner. Metal shelving on 3 walls, a single folding table, a monitor that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the installation was built. Fenna set her folder on the table, asked the young specialist manning the room, a quiet woman named Teo, to pull the complete training and recovery files for all 14 removed dogs, and settled in. Teo brought the first stack 20 minutes later and watched Fenna flip through them with the speed of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "You've read K9 training logs before," Teo said. "Yes." "Most consultants ask us to summarize them." "I know." Fenna didn't look up. "That's why most consultants miss things." The records told a story that the official report had worked hard to obscure. The 14 removed dogs showed a clear pattern, not of genetic instability or unpredictable aggression, but of escalation without resolution. Someone had been pushing these animals into high alert states using intensified aggression protocols, which was standard enough in working K9 training, but the recovery phase, the critical step where a dog was brought back down from peak arousal, reinforced for calm, and taught to regulate, had been shortened. In some cases, cut entirely. She found it across file after file. Escalation logged, recovery logged as completed in 15 minutes or less. In one case, 8 minutes. 8 minutes was not a recovery session. 8 minutes was a notation. She turned to a new file. Dog designation Brask, male Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, formerly assessed as high potential. Recent incident log, 1 bite to handler's forearm during restraint attempt. Current status. Scheduled evaluation for behavioral termination. Fenna read the Brask file twice. Then she read the handler assignment log. Brask's last 6 months of training had been run entirely under one handler, Senior Sergeant Mac Tolliver. She wrote the name down. Then she went back to the beginning of the files and cross-referenced every removed dog against its handler assignments over the past year. Tolliver appeared in 11 of the 14 cases. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she wrote that number down too. The first conversation with Colonel Harlan Valand happened in his office at 1400 hours, and it established very quickly what kind of man Valand was. He was the kind who had arranged his office to convey authority through visual accumulation, commendations framed at precise intervals, unit photographs arranged by year, a desk positioned so that visitors sat slightly lower than he did. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, silver at the temples, and he had the smooth professional manner of someone who had learned very early that appearing calm was more useful than being right. He offered Fenna coffee. She declined. "I've reviewed your preliminary access request," Valand said, folding his hands on his desk. "I understand the MJRO has concerns about the program's statistical outcomes." "They do," Fenna said. "So do I, after reviewing the records this morning." The removal rate reflects a difficult reality about working K9s at this operational level. These animals are under significant stress. The removal rate reflects incomplete recovery training, Fenna said. She wasn't aggressive about it. She said it the same way she'd say a patient's blood pressure was elevated, as a fact that required a response, not a debate. I can show you the documentation. Vayland looked at her with the specific expression of someone reassessing what category to file her in. Ms. Walgrave, I've been running this program for 4 years. My handlers are experienced. Senior Sergeant Tolliver's dogs account for 11 of your 14 removals, Fenna said. That's not an animal problem. That's a methodology problem. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that had texture. Vayland set down his coffee cup with a careful deliberateness, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not quite. More like a man quietly moving pieces on a board she couldn't yet see. Tolliver is one of our most decorated handlers, Vayland said. His methods are based on established Iron Ridge doctrine. I'd like to see the full doctrine documentation, Fenna said. The original training framework, not the summary. Another pause, shorter this time. I can have that prepared for you. I'd appreciate that. Fenna stood. I'd also like to observe Tolliver's training session tomorrow morning, if one is scheduled. I'll arrange it, Vayland said. He was still smiling. It was the smile of a man who had just started calculating. Fenna thanked him and left. In the corridor outside his office, she stopped and took a breath and thought about what she hadn't said in that room, which was that she had already recognized the name of the doctrine the program was built on. She had recognized it because she'd heard a version of it before, years ago, under a different name, her name, in a context nobody at Harwick would ever voluntarily connect to her. She needed more documentation before she said anything about that. She went back to the records room. It was nearly 1700 when Corville found her still at the folding table with 3 parallel stacks of files and a legal pad covered in her own shorthand. He leaned in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him. Teo said you've been in here since 1100, he said. I needed to finish the cross-reference. He came in and looked at the stacks, not with suspicion, more with the careful curiosity of someone who was good at pattern recognition themselves, and could see that she'd built something structured. You found something. I found several things. She set down her pen. How long have you been at this installation? 3 years. And Tolliver? Corville was quiet for a beat. He was here when I arrived. What do you think of his training methods? Another pause. Corville pulled out the second chair and sat down. He rubbed the side of his jaw. He gets results in the short term, he said carefully. The dogs come out aggressive, fast. They perform well in evaluation windows. And then? And then some of them fall apart. He said it like he'd been saying it to himself for a while and was tired of not saying it to anyone else. I flagged it to Vayland 6 months ago. He told me the removals were within expected variance. 11 out of 14 removal cases in 11 months, all under one handler, is not within expected variance. No, Corville said. It isn't. Fenna looked at him steadily. I need to see Brask. The dog's scheduled for behavioral termination. Corville's jaw tightened. That evaluation is in 68 hours. I know. Vayland approved the termination order personally. I know that too. She held his gaze. I need to see the dog. Corville was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and said, Kennel closes to non-essential personnel at 1800. Come back at 600. It wasn't permission exactly. It was something adjacent to it, offered by a man who had been watching a problem get worse for 6 months and had run out of patience for waiting. Fenna nodded. I'll be here. She was. The training yard at 0600 was cold and gray and almost peaceful, the dogs in their individual runs going through their morning routines with the specific alert-rest cycle of animals that had been bred for work and knew the difference between downtime and standby. Corville was already there when Fenna arrived, and he walked her to the far end of the kennel block without ceremony. Brask's run was in the last position. The dog was pacing. Not the frantic pacing of an animal in distress, something more controlled than that, with a coiled quality that made the small space feel tighter than it was. He was a big Malinois, darker than most, with the kind of physical density that came from serious conditioning. When Fenna stopped at the run gate, he turned and fixed his gaze on her and held it, which was itself information. An animal that had genuinely broken didn't hold eye contact that clean and that steady. He bit Tolliver's assistant handler during a restraint attempt 3 weeks ago, Corvell said. Drew blood. Enough for an incident report. Was the restraint provoked? According to the report, the dog became aggressive during a standard training evolution. And the training evolution was? Corvell was quiet for a moment. Repeated exposure to high-stress stimuli without a recovery interval. Fenna looked at the dog. The dog looked back at her. His pacing had stopped the moment she stepped up to the gate. She noticed that. She also noticed the way he was holding his weight. Not balanced for a lunge, not braced for a fight. He was assessing. How long has he been in this run? Since the incident, 3 weeks. 3 weeks in a 10-by-12 run for a dog bred and trained for field work. That was its own kind of damage. Fenna crouched down to the dog's eye level. She didn't reach through the gate. She just crouched there and let him adjust to her presence the way she'd learned to do with animals that had been pushed past their tolerance threshold. Not with force, not with submission, just with stillness that had no agenda attached to it. Brask watched her for 30 seconds. Then he took 2 steps toward her and sat down. Corvell exhaled slowly behind her. Miss Walgrave, he said. What exactly is your background? She didn't answer immediately. She was watching the dog's breathing slow, the tension in his shoulders release by degrees, the hard line of his posture soften just slightly. Not into weakness, into something more like recognition. I was a combat behavior specialist for 6 years before I went back to nursing, she said finally. K9 psychology was my primary research focus. Published? She stood up. Extensively. She didn't say the rest of it, that the publications had her name on them, that the research had been formally recognized, that the system she'd spent 6 years building had been taken apart and reconstructed and relaunched under a different architecture and a different set of names. She didn't say any of that. She didn't have enough documentation yet, but she was getting there. But the session with Tolliver's training group happened at EO 900, and it was worse than the records had suggested, and worse than Corvell's careful language had implied. Tolliver was a large, efficient man who moved with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously questioned in a professional setting. He ran his 3 assigned dogs through a sequence that looked rigorous and structured on the surface: obstacle navigation, target engagement, controlled aggression drills. But Fenna watched the recovery intervals with a stopwatch and wrote down what she saw. 11 minutes for the first dog to cycle through a full high-intensity aggression sequence. 8 minutes of recovery, consisting of a handler lead hold and 2 brief reward events with no genuine physiological downtime built in. Back into the next escalation sequence before the dog's respiration had returned to baseline. She watched this happen twice before she wrote anything. The third time, she wrote a single number at the bottom of her legal pad. 0. As in, 0 chance this was coincidental. 0 chance the methodology was ignorant rather than intentional. 0 chance the records had been wrong about what they implied. Tolliver noticed her writing during the 3rd cycle and came over during the handler water break with his arms crossed and his body language set to a frequency she'd encountered many times before. The specific posture of a man who intended to intimidate someone he considered a procedural inconvenience. The MJRO consultant, he said, Fenna Walgrave. You're welcome to observe, he said, but I'd appreciate if you didn't disrupt the handler's concentration with the notepad. I'm not disrupting anyone, Fenna said. I'm documenting what I observe. That's the assignment. What you're observing is a high-performance K9 training program with a 17-year methodology behind it. Fenna looked at him directly. How long are your recovery intervals? Tolliver's eyes hardened slightly. Long enough. According to the established K9 behavioral framework, the one your doctrine is based on, minimum effective recovery for a Malinois following a high-arousal aggression cycle is 22 minutes at baseline, 32 for animals with prior stress loading. She paused. You're running 8 minutes. Those numbers are out of date. The research they're based on is 11 years old, she said. I know because I conducted it. The yard went a little quieter around them. 2 nearby handlers had gone still. Tolliver smiled, but it was the kind of smile that was doing something else entirely underneath. You conducted research. Yes. And now you're a nurse. I'm both, she said. The qualifications didn't cancel each other out. She wrote one more thing on her legal pad and capped her pen and turned back toward the kennel entrance before he could respond. She didn't need the last word. She needed the documentation, and she had enough for the next phase of the report. What she didn't need was the conversation that happened 15 minutes later, in the corridor outside Valen's office, where she overheard Tolliver's voice and Valen's voice in close, low tones that stopped when she passed the door and resumed when they assumed she was out of range. She wasn't out of range, she didn't stop walking, she didn't slow down. But she heard enough. And what she heard was Valen telling Tolliver to get the documentation pulled before she finds the originals. Fenna went directly back to the records room. Teo was gone. A different specialist was at the desk, younger, less familiar with her access level, and he looked up with the uncertain expression of someone who'd been briefed on limited terms. "Miss Walgrave, I was told you'd completed your records review." "By whom?" The specialist hesitated. "The colonel's office called down about 20 minutes ago." "My access card is still active," she said pleasantly. "I need to pull the original training framework documents, pre-2019. "Those would be in archive," he said. He looked at his screen. "I'd need to get authorization for archive access." "Please do." He reached for his phone. Fenna looked at the shelves and located the section for archived administrative records, pre-current command, and started reading spines while he made his call. The call took 4 minutes. When he hung up, his expression had done something complicated. "I'm sorry, Ms. Walgrave, the Colonel's office says archived framework documentation is under current administrative review and isn't available for external access at this time." Fenna turned from the shelves. "When was that restriction placed?" He checked his screen. "The notation is from this morning." This morning. Approximately 40 minutes ago, while she was in the training yard watching Tolliver run his dogs. She looked at the specialist with what she hoped was a neutral expression, because what she was actually feeling was not neutral at all. It was the cold, clarifying anger of someone who had been exactly here before, in a slightly different room, watching documentation disappear from her reach for reasons that had nothing to do with protocol. "Thank you," she said. She picked up her folder. "I'll route the archive request through the MJRO directly." She left the records room and walked to the end of the corridor where there was a window that looked out over the training yard. She stood there for a moment and watched the dogs in their runs and thought about what she had and what she didn't have yet. She had the removal statistics. She had the recovery interval documentation. She had the handler assignment cross-reference. She had what she'd overheard outside Valen's office. And she had 11 years of knowledge in her own memory that told her exactly what she was looking at. What she didn't have yet was the original documentation, the framework she'd submitted in 2013, the research that had been formally archived under her name before it was somehow unformally archived under someone else's methodology. She knew it existed. She'd kept copies. But copies in a civilian's private files wouldn't carry the weight she needed against a colonel with 17 years of institutional credibility. She needed the military archived original. She pulled out her phone and called her contact at the Military Justice Review Office, a senior advisor named Greer Tandos, who picked up on the second ring. "I need an expedited archive pull," Fenna said. "Pre-2019 K9 behavioral framework documents, Harwick installation, and I need it before someone here buries them." Greer was quiet for a moment. "How bad is it?" Fenna looked out the window at Brask's Run, where she could just make out the dark shape of the dog moving at his slow, steady pace. "There's a dog scheduled to die in 66 hours for behavior problems that were deliberately created," she said. "And the methodology that caused it was taken from research I conducted and published and formally submitted, under my name, before someone decided it was more useful under theirs." Another pause. "Fenna, I know how it sounds. It sounds like you've been sitting on this for a while. I needed to be sure it wasn't coincidence before I said it out loud to anyone official." She paused. "I'm sure." Greer exhaled. "I'll get the pull request in within the hour. Anything else?" "Keep it quiet on your end," she said. "Valand already knows I'm looking. He doesn't need to know what I found." She hung up and stood at the window a moment longer. Down in the yard, one of Tolliver's dogs was running a bite drill at the far end, controlled and powerful, and completely unaware that the system supposed to protect it had been doing the opposite for 11 months. The handler pulled the dog off the sleeve, and the dog stood there vibrating with unspent adrenaline and nowhere good to put it. Fenna watched the handler clip the lead back on without a recovery command. without a word, without anything. The dog stood there for a moment, then started pacing. She turned away from the window and went to find Corvell. She needed an ally inside the fence, and her instincts, which she trusted more than most people trusted instruments, said she'd already found one. She just needed to confirm it before tomorrow's session, before Valen found another way to tighten the access, before the archive request came back, and before Brask's clock ran down any further. She found Corvell in the equipment room checking leads and harnesses with the focused attention of someone who found the maintenance work genuinely grounding. He looked up when she came in and read her expression before she said a word. "They pulled your records access," he said. "Restricted it. Through the colonel's office." He set down the harness he was holding. "When?" "About 40 minutes ago, while I was in the training yard." Corvell didn't say anything for a moment. He stood there with his hands braced on the equipment table and looked at the wall, and she could see him making a calculation she wasn't privy to, weighing something that clearly had more weight to it than professional caution. "There's a storage room," he said finally, "at the back of the old training block, the one they stopped using after the 2018 renovation." He picked up the harness again. "Some of the original program documentation from before Valen's command got left there when they moved the records to the new system. Nobody filed a formal transfer because nobody thought the old records mattered anymore." He went back to checking the harness with complete concentration, as if he'd said something entirely routine. Fenna looked at him. "Corvell." "The old block is unlocked during maintenance hours," he said, not looking up. "Which are 1400 to 600. She held on to that information for a moment. "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for just long enough that she knew it wasn't a simple answer. "Because Brask didn't have to be what he became," he said finally. "And I've watched 3 other dogs get labeled the same way in the past year, and I'm tired of watching good animals take the blame for bad training." He set the harness in the checked pile and picked up the next one. Fenna left the equipment room and checked the time. It was 11:22. She had until 1400 before the maintenance window opened, and she needed to be in the old training block before anyone with reason to stop her noticed where she was going. The documentation she needed might be sitting in a storage room at the back of an unused building, in files nobody had thought important enough to move or destroy. And somewhere across the yard, a dog with 64 hours left on a termination order was pacing a 10-by-12 run, waiting for someone to see what she had already seen. That what looked like damage was something entirely different. That what had been deliberately broken could still be put back together. She needed that evidence. She needed it before Valen's people found it first. And she was already thinking about what happened after. Because she hadn't come to Harwick just to write a report. She'd come because the MJRO had sent her, yes, but also because 2 months ago a colleague had forwarded her an obscure unit newsletter that referenced the Iron Ridge K9 Behavioral Recovery Framework as a training innovation pioneered by this installation. Her framework, her recovery sequences, her 11 years of documented research, under the name of a program she had never worked for. She had not said one word about that to Valand. She had not said one word to Corvell, not really, not the whole of it. She had said it once to Greer Tandos on a phone call, and now she had said the skeleton of it once more today. The rest of it was in a storage room she couldn't reach for another 2 hours and 18 minutes. She went to the canteen and bought a coffee she didn't particularly want, and sat down at a corner table where she could see the door and went through her folder one more time, cross-referencing everything she'd written this morning against everything she already knew. The numbers lined up the same way they had the first time she looked at them. They were going to keep lining up the same way no matter how many times she looked, because numbers didn't rearrange themselves out of professional courtesy. 11 dogs. 1 handler. A methodology built from stolen research. A commander who had just ordered the burial of original documentation 40 minutes after realizing someone was finally looking. And a 4th-year Malinois in a concrete run who had been set up to fail so spectacularly that his failure could be used to justify everything else. Fenna drank her coffee and waited. And the waiting felt like the hardest part, until she remembered that the hard part hadn't even started yet. The door to the canteen opened and Tolliver walked in. He saw her immediately. He got coffee from the counter and walked to a table on the other side of the room without acknowledging her, but she felt the weight of his awareness across the space like a second presence. He was watching her the same way she was reading files, systematically, looking for what she knew and what she was planning to do with it. She looked back down at her folder. She had 63 hours. The old training block unlocked in 2 hours and 11 minutes. And somewhere at the Military Justice Review Office, Greer Tandos was making a call that was going to shake the foundation of this installation, or go nowhere, depending on how deep the paperwork had already been buried. Fenna turned to a fresh page in her legal pad. At the top of it, she wrote one name, Brask. Then she started writing what she was going to say in the formal report, and what she was going to say to Valand, and what she was going to say to the review board when it came to that. Because it was going to come to that, she was sure of it now. What she was less sure about was what would happen in the next 63 hours, and whether the documentation in that storage room still existed, and whether Valand already knew it was there. She didn't look up when Tolliver left the canteen. She kept writing. She kept writing, and the coffee went cold beside her, and the canteen slowly filled with the midday rotation of handlers and support staff who looked at the woman alone at the corner table with a legal pad and made the same quiet calculation people always made about her, that she was administrative, peripheral, probably temporary. None of them came over. That was fine. She didn't need company. She needed 1400 to arrive. It did eventually, the way all dreaded and necessary things do. Not dramatically, just as the next number on a clock. Fenna capped her pen, collected her folder, and walked out of the canteen without hurrying. She had already identified the route to the old training block that morning, during her initial walk of the installation grounds. A habit she'd kept from her years doing field assessments. Always map the space before you need to move through it quickly. The old training block was a low concrete structure set back from the main kennel complex by about 40 meters, separated by a stretch of gravel and a row of utility vehicles that hadn't moved in what looked like weeks. The building's original function was visible in its architecture. Wide sliding doors, drainage channels in the floor, the kind of ventilation design that accommodated large animals. Now it stored equipment overflow and what Corvell had suggested might be something considerably more useful. She walked to it without looking like she was walking to it, which was a skill in itself. The side door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was cool and flat and smelled like rubber matting and old paper, which was exactly the smell she was hoping for. She let her eyes adjust to the reduced light from the high transom windows and took inventory of the space. Storage shelving along the east wall, equipment crates stacked in the center, and in the northwest corner, a row of filing cabinets that had the specific look of things that had been placed somewhere temporarily and then forgotten about so thoroughly that the temporary became permanent. She went straight to the cabinets. The first one was labeled by year along the drawer fronts in fading marker, 2014, 2015, 2016. The second cabinet picked up from 2017. The third was unlabeled except for a strip of masking tape on the top drawer that read, Pre-command, Archive. Do not discard in handwriting that wasn't recent. She opened the top drawer of the third cabinet. The files inside were organized by category, not by date, training frameworks, handler assessments, behavioral research integration reports. The tabs were typed on paper labels that had yellowed at the edges and curled slightly at the corners. Fenna flipped through them with careful speed, reading each tab without pulling the files, building a map of what was here. She found it in the third section. K9 Behavioral Recovery, Research Integration, Walgrave Protocol, FY 2013. She stood there for a moment and looked at that label. Her own name in fading type on a file folder in a forgotten cabinet in an unused building on a military installation that had spent the last several years pretending she'd never been here. She pulled the file. It was thick, 60-some pages, she estimated without counting, which was right. She remembered writing it. She remembered the specific weight of the completed document when she submitted it, the way the research lead had signed the cover page in blue ink. She opened to the cover page and there it was, her full name, her military consultant designation, the formal research submission date, and the original program title, Graduated Arousal Recovery Framework for Military Working K9 Behavioral Stabilization. Not the Iron Ridge K9 Behavioral Recovery Framework, not the name it had been given when it was relaunched as this installation's proprietary innovation. Her name, her title, her date. She photographed every page with her phone, methodically, without rushing, without celebrating, because she had learned a long time ago that finding the thing you needed was only the beginning of what it cost to actually use it. She photographed the cover page twice to make sure the signatures were clear. She was on page 31 when she heard the side door open behind her. She closed the file folder without startling, turned around without rushing, and faced the person who had just come in. It was not Corvell. It was a young handler she recognized from the training yard, one of the 4 who had been running drills when she first arrived. Specialist level, from his rank insignia, which meant he was relatively new. He stopped when he saw her and his expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, and then a more complicated uncertainty. "Ms. Walgrave," he said. "Specialist." He glanced at the filing cabinet, then at her phone, which was still in her hand with the camera interface visible. "I was looking for an equipment manifest, for the harness inventory." "The equipment manifests are on the center shelving," Fenna said. She gestured toward the crates. "Third stack from the left." He looked at the stack, looked at her again. She could see him deciding something. Not whether to report what he'd seen, she suspected, but how much of what he'd seen he understood. "Are you finding what you need?" he asked carefully. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, went to the shelving, found the manifest he'd cited without searching for it, which meant he'd known exactly where it was, which meant the equipment manifest reason was real, or he was a better actor than a specialist his age had any reason to be. He took the manifest and left. Fenna finished photographing the file, replaced it precisely where she'd found it. She needed it there, not missing, when the formal archive request came through, and locked the filing cabinet drawer and left the building the same way she'd entered, unhurried, with her phone in her pocket and 62 pages of documented evidence stored in her camera roll. She walked back across the gravel toward the main kennel complex. Her phone buzzed. Greer Tandos. "The archive poll came back flagged," Greer said without preamble. "Pre-2019 framework documents for Harwick K9 are listed as under active administrative review. The flag was placed this morning." "I know. Someone moved fast." "Fenna, an administrative review flag blocks official access for up to 90 days. I can escalate, but that takes a hearing, and a hearing takes— "I don't need the official pull anymore," Fenna said. "I found the originals." Silence. "Where?" "In a storage room in an unused building that nobody thought to flag because nobody remembered it existed." She paused. "They're intact. I have photographs of the complete document." "That's—" Greer stopped. Started again. "You need to be careful about how that's entered into the record. Photographs from a non-official access." "The filing cabinet was in an unlocked building during maintenance hours," Fenna said. "My access card covers the entire installation during working hours. I didn't break anything. I didn't take anything. I documented what I found." Another pause. "I'm going to need to run this by legal." "Run it. I'll be here." She stopped walking and looked at the kennel complex ahead of her. "Greer, I need you to understand something. There is a dog in this facility with less than 60 hours before a termination order is executed. The behavioral problems that justify that order were caused by deliberate training malpractice, and the methodology used to cause them was derived from research that was taken from me and relaunched under this program's name without attribution or authorization." She kept her voice level. "I'm not filing a complaint about the research theft. I'm telling you it happened because it is directly connected to why the dog is scheduled to die. Valen needs to look like the program works. A dog labeled unrecoverable is evidence the program makes tough calls. A dog that was deliberately broken to be labeled that way is something else entirely." Greer was quiet for a long moment. "Send me the photographs." Fenna sent them from the gravel path behind the utility vehicles, standing in the thin afternoon light with the sound of the dogs carrying from the near kennel. She watched the upload progress bar and thought about what came next. What came next was Tolliver. She heard the argument before she saw it. Raised voices from the direction of the K9 medical corridor. Not screaming, but the compressed, deliberate volume of men who were angry and trying not to sound it in a space with carrying acoustics. Fenna followed the sound and came to the intersection outside the recovery ward, where Corvell and Tolliver were standing 6 feet apart with a veterinary technician named Sable caught visibly between them and clearly wanting to be somewhere else. Fenna stopped at the corner. "Not your call," Corvell was saying, flat and controlled. "The evaluation is in 2 days. The protocol allows for third-party behavioral assessment before a termination order is finalized." "The protocol allows it if the assessment is requested by a qualified handler," Tolliver said. "You're not the assigned handler for Brask." No, I'm senior second handler for the unit and I'm requesting a formal assessment period. Valand already approved the evaluation outcome. The room went a degree cooler. Corvell's voice dropped. He approved the evaluation outcome before the evaluation has taken place. Tolliver didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The silence where the answer should have been said everything it needed to say. Fenna stepped around the corner. All three of them turned. Sable looked relieved in the specific way of someone who has just been handed a reason to exit. Ms. Walgrave, Tolliver said, and his voice was doing the smile that isn't thing again. Touring the facility? Following up on this morning's records review, she said. She looked at Corvell briefly, then back at Tolliver. I understand there's a discussion about the formal assessment protocol for Brask. There's no discussion, Tolliver said. The evaluation date and procedure are set. The outcome has been professionally assessed. The outcome was assessed before the evaluation, Fenna said, and she said it quietly enough that it would have sounded mild if not for the fact that it was a precise repetition of what Corvell had just said, in front of a witness, in a corridor with an acoustic profile she was already factoring. That's worth noting in the formal record. Tolliver's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it recalibrated. You're a medical consultant on a facility review. You don't have standing to alter the evaluation procedure. I have standing to document what I observe, she said, and to submit that documentation to the Military Justice Review Office, which has standing to do considerably more. She paused. I'd also like to formally request access to Brask's handler assignment history going back 18 months. If that request is denied, I'll need to note the denial and the reason given. The corridor held very still for a moment. Sable had successfully removed herself around a distant corner. Tolliver looked at Fenna with the expression of a man revising his estimate of something he thought he'd already calculated correctly. Then he looked at Corvell. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come without another word. Corvell let out a breath that wasn't quite audible. He's going to Valand. Yes, Fenna said, which means you have less time than I'd like and more than I need, she said. I found the original documents. Corvell turned to look at her directly. 62 pages, she said. Pre-command, original submission, with signatures and dates. The whole framework, under my name, with a submission date that predates the Iron Ridge program's founding by 3 years. He stared at her. It was still there. In the third filing cabinet in the northwest corner of the old block. Nobody thought to flag a building that doesn't appear in the current records system. Corvell ran a hand through his hair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of someone recalibrating. Valand is going to know you found something. If Tolliver reports back that you pushed on the evaluation protocol, he already knows I'm looking, Fenna said. He's known since yesterday afternoon. The question is whether he can move fast enough to matter. She pulled out her phone. He can't. The photographs are already with the MJRO. Corvell was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? I need access to Brask for a formal behavioral assessment, not a termination evaluation, a recovery assessment using the original protocol framework. Tolliver just told you the evaluation procedure is set. Tolliver is a senior handler, she said. He's not the veterinary authority. Who signs the medical clearance on the termination order? Corvell considered that. Vet Officer Strand, Dr. Mira Strand. Has she signed it yet? The final signature is scheduled for 24 hours before the evaluation. So she hasn't signed it. Not yet. Then I'd like to talk to Dr. Strand, Fenna said. Dr. Mira Strand was in her 40s, direct to the edge of blunt, and had the particular quality of someone who had spent years operating in an environment that required constant recalibration between institutional authority and professional integrity. She listened to Fenna for 11 minutes without interrupting, which was longer than most people gave her, and when Fenna stopped, she sat behind her desk and looked at the middle distance for a moment. The photographs you mentioned, Strand said, the original research documentation. Submitted to the MJRO as of this afternoon. And your claim is that Brask's behavioral profile, what's in his current evaluation record, is the direct result of deliberate training malpractice. My claim is that the evidence supports that reading, Fenna said. I'd rather the data make the claim. Strand almost smiled. What do you need from me? Don't sign the termination clearance until there's a formal MJRO review of the handler assignment history and the recovery protocol records. The clearance is scheduled for tomorrow at 0800. I know. Strand looked at her steadily. If I delay the clearance, Valand will know immediately. Yes. He'll have grounds to dispute my authority to delay if the evaluation procedure has already been formally set. He'll try, Fenna said. But a veterinary medical clearance is the vet officer's professional prerogative. He can dispute the delay, but he can't override a medical hold. Strand tapped her pen against her desk. Once, twice. You're asking me to put myself in the middle of something that sounds considerably larger than a single dog's evaluation. I'm asking you to not sign a death warrant for an animal whose condition was intentionally manufactured, Fenna said. Everything else is separate. Another long pause. Strand looked at the pen in her hand. I'll need to document the clinical basis for the delay. I can provide the behavioral assessment data to support it, Fenna said. You'd need access to Brask for that. I know. Strand set the pen down. Come back at 0700 tomorrow. I'll arrange access. She looked at Fenna with the level expression of someone who had made a decision and was already thinking about what it cost. Don't be late. Fenna was already standing to leave. I won't be. She left the veterinary office and walked back through the kennel corridor and out into the late afternoon yard, where the light had gone long and gold and the handlers were running the evening cool-down with their dogs. She stopped for a moment and watched. The handlers, the dogs, the specific dynamic of each pair, the quality of attention the animals paid to the humans beside them. Which dogs leaned in, which ones held a subtle distance, which handlers noticed, and which didn't. She noticed, across the yard, Corvell, with his own assigned K9, a compact female Malinois named Vex, who moved with the easy intelligence of a dog that had been trained by someone who understood what they were doing. The dog kept glancing up at Corvell between commands, not anxiously, just checking in. That was the difference, condensed into a single behavioral detail. A dog that checked in because it wanted to, because the relationship had been built on something real. She needed that for Brask. She needed to show Strand's clinical documentation that the animal currently labeled unrecoverable could still choose to check in if given the conditions for it. She had until 0700. She went back to her temporary quarters on the visitor side of the installation, spread her notes across the small desk, and started building the assessment framework she was going to walk into that kennel with tomorrow. She worked through dinner, through the installation's evening transition, through the hour when the kennel sounds dropped to the quiet nighttime register of animals settled in their runs. At 22:30, her phone buzzed with a text from Greer Tandos that said only, "Legal cleared the photographs. You have what you need. Do not engage Valand directly before we confirm the formal review date." Gee, she texted back. Understood. There's one more thing I need to do first. She didn't elaborate. She worked for another 2 hours and then she slept, which was a professional discipline more than anything else. Because what was coming tomorrow required precision, and she was no use to anyone. Not to Strand, not to Corvell, not to the dog in the concrete run. If she walked in exhausted. She set her alarm for 0530 and closed her eyes and listened to the distant sound of the installation and thought about nothing in particular, which was the version of rest she'd learned to access when actual sleep took its time arriving. It arrived eventually. At 0630, she was in the kennel corridor outside the veterinary assessment room with her behavioral framework notes, a handful of specific equipment requests, and the particular kind of focused quiet that wasn't calm exactly. It was more like the thing underneath calm, the state that existed before performance and after preparation. Strand arrived at 0655, keys in hand, coffee in the other, and looked at Fenna the way people looked at someone who had clearly been ready for a while. "How long have you been here?" Strand asked. "Since 0630. Eat anything?" "I'll eat after." Strand unlocked the assessment room door. "The access I arranged is for the veterinary assessment bay, not the main kennel run. I had Brask moved at 0600. She pushed the door open. "He's been in the bay for 30 minutes. He's not settled." Fenna went in. The assessment bay was larger than Brask's regular run, 12 by 20, with rubberized flooring and ventilation panels along the upper wall. Brask was at the far end when she entered, and he was indeed not settled. He was moving the perimeter of the space with his head low and his muscles carrying that specific braced tension of an animal that had been moved from one uncertain space to another uncertain space and had learned to anticipate bad things from transitions. Strand stood in the doorway. Fenna walked to the center of the bay and stopped. She didn't speak. She didn't crouch. She didn't do anything calculated to signal safety, because Brask had been around too many calculated signals and had learned to read the gap between the signal and what followed it. She just stood in the center of the space and breathed steadily and let him decide how to interpret her presence. He paced the perimeter twice more. The third circuit, he slowed at the point nearest her. The fourth, he stopped. Fenna stayed still. Brask lifted his head and looked at her. Not the threat assessment look. Something different. Something that was reading a different set of data. She said the word. Quietly, the same register she'd used with Argo that first morning in the yard. One syllable. The recovery command she had built into the original framework because she'd understood, after years of research, that the crucial thing wasn't teaching a working dog to escalate. Aggression was easy. Aggression was the default. The crucial thing was giving the animal a word that meant, this is over now. You're safe. Stand down. Easy. Brask's body changed. It didn't collapse. It wasn't dramatic. It was the specific physical shift of a system releasing something it had been holding too long, shoulders dropping a fraction, the set of his jaw loosening, his feet shifting from the balls to the full pad. He stood there and breathed and looked at her. Then he walked forward and stopped 3 feet away and sat down. Strand was very quiet in the doorway. Fenna looked at the dog in front of her, at the dog that Tolliver had pushed past every limit she'd designed the recovery protocol to prevent, the dog that Valand had signed a termination order for, the dog that a whole program worth of convenient paperwork had decided was broken beyond return. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved. And then Fenna heard the sound she had not been expecting. Footsteps in the corridor, more than one pair, moving fast and with purpose, and Strand turning sharply in the doorway, and a voice she recognized without needing to see its owner. Colonel Valand. Dr. Strand. His voice carried the particular measured coldness of a man who had decided to stop managing and start overriding. I'm going to need to ask you to step aside. This assessment has not been formally authorized through the chain of command, and I'm revoking the access that was arranged for this morning. Strand's voice came back steady. The access falls under veterinary medical authority. You don't have standing. I have standing as installation commander, Valand said. Ms. Walgrave. His voice shifted direction, addressing her through the open door. Please step away from the animal and accompany the MPs to my office. Fenna didn't move immediately. She looked at Brask, who had not reacted to the voices with the alarm she'd expected. He was still watching her, still in the settled position, still processing the fact that someone had finally given him a word that meant what it said. She said quietly to the dog, Good. Then she stood and turned to face the door. There were 2 military police behind Valand, not threatening, positioned, which was different and in some ways worse, because position meant the decision had already been made before they arrived. Valand looked at her with the expression of a man who had correctly assessed that this woman was more trouble than he'd budgeted for, and was now moving to contain the situation before it got any further out of hand. Ms. Walgrave, he said again, my office. Fenna picked up her folder. She walked toward the door. And in the last moment before she crossed the threshold, her phone, face up in her folder, lit with a message from Greer Tandos that she saw before she could read it properly. But she caught 3 words in the preview line that were enough. 3 words that changed everything about the next 24 hours. They found the originals. Not we found copies. Not we found references. They found the originals. The physical, signed, dated, officially archived originals that Valand had flagged under administrative review that morning, apparently not knowing that the MJRO had a parallel access route through the Department of Defense records system that a unit-level commander couldn't touch with an installation flag. Fenna walked through the door. She kept her face neutral and her pace steady, and she did not look at her phone again because Valand was watching her with the focused attention of a man reading for tells, and she had nothing to gain from showing him that the message had landed. The walk to his office was 4 minutes. The 2 MPs stayed a half step behind her the entire way, not touching, not threatening, just present in the way that was designed to communicate institutional weight without crossing into the kind of conduct that would show up badly in a formal review. Valand walked ahead, setting the pace. She used the 4 minutes. She thought about the originals. If the MJRO had physical documents, not photographs, not digital files, the actual archived originals with ink signatures. Then what she'd found in the storage room moved from corroborating evidence to redundant confirmation, which was better than she'd let herself plan for. It meant the record existed in two independent chains of custody. It meant Wayland couldn't flag both of them. It meant the documentation was no longer something he could administratively slow down into irrelevance. It also meant the next conversation in his office was going to be a different conversation than the one he thought he was walking into. Wayland's office looked the same as it had 2 days ago. Same framed commendations, same unit photographs arranged by year, same desk position for the slight height advantage. He sat down behind it. The MPs positioned themselves near the door, which they closed. Fenna sat in the chair across from him without being invited to. He looked at her for a moment. "I'm going to be direct with you, Ms. Walgrave. Please. You've been on this installation for 36 hours, and you've disrupted 2 active training sessions, accessed restricted documentation, pressured a veterinary officer to delay a formally scheduled procedure, and conducted an unauthorized assessment of an animal under active termination review." He folded his hands on the desk. "Any one of those individually would give me grounds to revoke your access and have you escorted off the installation." "Then you should do that," Fenna said. He blinked. "If any of those actions constitute a genuine violation of my access parameters," she said, "you should revoke my access and file a formal complaint with the MJRO. That complaint would go into the record alongside my report." She paused. "Is that what you want in the record right now?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Wayland's expression didn't change much, but the quality of it shifted. The smooth professional manner recalibrating into something with more calculation underneath it. "What is it you think you've found?" he asked. "I think we both know what I've found," Fenna said. "The question you actually want answered is what I plan to do with it." "And what do you plan to do with it?" She looked at him steadily. "My job." Another pause. Wayland looked at his desk. When he looked back up, something in the performance had dropped. Not much, just enough for her to see the shape of the man underneath the commendations and the carefully positioned furniture. "The research that framework is based on," he said carefully, "was developed within a collaborative process that involved multiple contributors. Attribution in that kind of research context is, the document has one name on the cover page," Fenna said, "mine, with a formal submission date, under a program that predates this installation's framework by 3 years. She kept her voice level. "I'm not here about the attribution. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because 11 dogs were removed from service, and one is scheduled for euthanasia tomorrow, because the methodology that caused it was derived from research that was then deliberately misapplied in ways the original framework explicitly warned against." She let that land. "The misapplication isn't coincidence. It's documented across 14 case files in your own record system." Wayland was quiet. "Brask," Fenna said. "That's the immediate issue. The rest of it goes in the report regardless. But Brask's termination order, I need that pulled. The evaluation has not yet received its medical clearance signature," she said. "Dr. Strand hasn't signed. You came to the assessment bay before she could, which tells me you were moving to prevent the delay she was going to issue." She paused. "Why would you need to prevent a delay if you were confident in the evaluation outcome?" The room was very quiet. Wayland picked up his pen, set it down. "I need to consult with legal before this conversation goes any further." "That's your right," Fenna said. "While you're doing that, I'd like to return to the assessment bay. That access has been revoked." "Then I'd like that revocation in writing," she said, "with the reasons cited. For the record." Another long pause. Wayland looked at her with the expression of a man who has reached the edge of the moves he'd prepared. What was behind his eyes now wasn't anger. It was something more like the recognition of a specific kind of loss. The kind that comes not all at once, but in accumulated moments when you realize the ground you thought was solid has been shifting for longer than you knew. He picked up his phone. Fenna waited. The call Wayland made was not to legal. She could tell from the first 30 seconds the register was wrong, too clipped, too much silence on his end listening. He'd called Tolliver, which told her something useful. Whatever the two of them had been doing with the records and the framework and the deliberate methodology failures, it was not a clean institutional arrangement. It was personal. It was protected by proximity rather than policy. and that meant it was considerably more vulnerable than Vayland had calculated. He ended the call and looked at her. I'm going to need you to stay in this office while I verify the status of your MJRO authorization. That's fine, Fenna said. She opened her folder. I have work to do. He left. The MPs stayed. One of them, young, maybe 23, doing a professional job of not looking like he was paying attention, Fenna opened to a fresh page on her legal pad and wrote the outline of her formal report in careful, specific language. She wrote for 40 minutes. She had been doing this long enough to know that the act of writing things down in clear, sequential language was both practical and psychological. It organized the evidence into a form that had to be responded to on its own terms. And it reminded her that what she had was real and documented and no longer dependent on what happened in this room. At the 40-minute mark, her phone buzzed with a call from Greer Tandos. She looked at the MPs. The younger one met her eyes briefly. I need to take this, she said. He didn't move to stop her. She answered. Where are you? Greer asked. Vayland's office. He's verifying my authorization. He's doing more than that. Greer's voice had the quality of someone managing urgency while trying not to amplify it. We got a call from the DoD records office 20 minutes ago. Someone from Harwick made an inquiry about the archive flag status on the K9 framework documents, specifically asking whether the flag would hold against an external access request. It doesn't, Fenna said. No, it doesn't, and they know that now. A pause. Fenna, you need to listen carefully. The formal review request has been filed. It's in the system, it's documented, and it cannot be pulled. What happens in the next few hours on that installation doesn't change the record. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She understood. She understood it clearly, and she also understood what the subtext was. That the record was secure, but that the record wasn't the same as what happened to Brask between now and the formal review date. I need Dr. Strand to delay that clearance signature, Fenna said, independently, before Vayland gets back to this office. Can she do that on her own authority? Yes, if she chooses to. Then call her. My calls are being observed. Brief silence. I'll call her, Greer said. Get me her direct line. Fenna gave it from memory and hung up. The younger MP was looking carefully at the wall. The other one had found something to study on the floor near his feet. Neither of them said anything. She chose to believe that was professional discretion rather than anything more complicated, because the alternative was that Vayland had briefed them, in which case the phone call had just accelerated a timeline she couldn't fully control. 11 minutes later, Vayland came back. He didn't look like a man who had successfully contained the situation. He looked like a man who had made several calls and gotten back information he didn't like, which had the effect of making his professional smoothness go slightly thin at the edges. He sat down. Your authorization has been confirmed, he said. The MJRO access credentials are current. I know, Fenna said. He looked at her. The formal review request. Filed, she said, as of this morning. Something passed through his expression that wasn't quite visible enough to name. He picked up his pen again. I'm releasing you back to full installation access, he said. The assessment bay situation was a miscommunication about protocol. I'll note that in my report, Fenna said pleasantly. She stood. I'd like to return to Dr. Strand's unit. He didn't say anything else. She walked out of his office and the MPs did not follow her, and the walk back to the veterinary corridor felt different from the walk to his office. Same installation, same concrete and fluorescent light, but the weight of the air had shifted in the way that spaces shift when a significant thing has just happened in them. Strand was standing outside the assessment bay when Fenna arrived, arms crossed, phone in her hand, with the expression of a woman who had just gotten off a call that had confirmed several things she'd already suspected. The MJRO called me, Strand said. I know. I'm not signing the clearance. I know. Strand looked at her. Is the dog actually recoverable, clinically? Because I need to be able to defend this delay on medical grounds, not procedural ones. Yes, Fenna said. He's recoverable. What you'll see in the assessment today will support that. Strand pushed the door open. Brask was where Fenna had left him, in the center of the bay, standing now rather than sitting, but without the perimeter pacing he'd been doing before. He turned when they entered, and his posture shifted through the brief threat read any well-trained Malinois did, with new entries, and then settled when he located Fenna in the room. Strand watched that happen. She didn't comment on it, but she was watching it, noting it, cataloging it in the precise clinical way of someone who was going to have to write it up with enough specificity to withstand a challenge. Fenna spent the next 90 minutes running the assessment. Not a standard evaluation, not the stimulus response testing Tolliver used, not the bite work performance sequence the handlers ran in the yard. She ran the recovery protocol. The actual one, from the original framework, the one she designed and documented and submitted 11 years ago. The graduated sequence that moved from low-level stress introduction to calm reinforcement to reintroduction, building the dog's capacity to regulate his own arousal state, rather than just teaching him to perform through it. It was not a smooth 90 minutes. Brask pushed back twice, once when she introduced a novel stimulus, and he went into a full alert posture that held for 4 minutes before she could walk him back down. And once when she moved through a sequence too quickly and felt him start to tip toward the edge of what he could manage, and had to back the whole process up and rebuild from a lower level. She noted both in her written record without softening them. Strand noted them too. But by the end of it, Brask had completed every element of the first phase recovery protocol. He wasn't fixed. 6 weeks of graduated work wouldn't undo 11 months of deliberate mishandling in 90 minutes, and Fenna would have been worried about herself if she'd thought otherwise. But he was responsive. He was capable of receiving and acting on the recovery command. He was not, by any clinical behavioral standard, an animal that had passed the point of no return. Strand signed the delay documentation at 11:30. The termination evaluation was formally postponed pending independent behavioral review. Wayland was informed by memo. Fenna was in the K9 records room when Corvell found her, and his expression when he came through the door told her the memo had landed in a way that had reverberated across the installation faster than memos usually moved. "Tolliver is pulling Brask's full handler file," Corvell said. "Someone in records called me. He went in 20 minutes ago and requested physical copies of everything." Fenna set down her pen. "On whose authorization?" "His own. Senior handler access covers current case files." "Brask's file is under active review status now that the clearance delay is filed," she said. "Active review locks the physical records. Does Tolliver know that?" "He will in about—" She checked the time. 10 minutes, when records processes the lock request." Corvell leaned against the doorframe. He looked tired in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was only now starting to register the weight. "How far does this go? The formal review? What happens to the program?" Fenna thought about how to answer that honestly. "The review establishes what the record shows," she said. "What the program looks like on the other side of it depends on what's found and who's responsible for what." "And Wayland?" "Wayland authorized a termination order for an animal whose condition was caused by his own program's methodology," she said. "He flagged records to prevent external review. He attempted to revoke legitimate access to a veterinary assessment." She picked up her pen. "Those are in the report." Corvell was quiet for a moment. 11 months, he said. I flagged it 6 months in. I wrote an internal memo." "I know. I found it in the files." He looked up. "You found it. It's in the record. It shows you identified the pattern and reported it through the correct channel, and the channel didn't respond." She held his gaze. "That matters." He nodded slowly. He looked like he hadn't known whether it would, and learning that it did was doing something complicated to whatever he'd been managing for 6 months. She went back to her report, and he went back to the yard, and the afternoon moved forward with the particular momentum of a situation that had passed the point where any individual decision could stop it. She wrote for 3 hours, with the documentation from the photographs alongside her and the recovery assessment notes from the morning and the cross-referenced handler files, and the internal memo from Corvell that nobody had acted on for 6 months. She was on the final section of the formal submission when her phone rang. "MJRO mainline, not Greer's direct number," she answered. "Ms. Walgrave?" A voice she didn't recognize, older, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that wasn't patience but authority. "This is Senior Review Director Olin Bathurst. I'm calling to inform you that the formal review of the Harwick K9 program has been escalated to the level of a full administrative investigation, effective immediately. 2 investigators are being dispatched to the installation." She held the phone steady. "When do they arrive?" "Tomorrow morning, 0800. I'd like you to remain on site through the initial intake. I'll be here, she said. I've reviewed your photographic documentation and the MJRO's copy of the original framework submission, Bathurst said. I want to ask you directly, Ms. Walgrave, how long have you known that the Iron Ridge framework was derived from your research? 2 months since I confirmed it, she said. I wanted to be certain before I said it to anyone with standing. A pause. And you came to this installation to investigate the K9 removals. I came because the MJRO sent me, she said. The rest of it I found when I got here. There's a distinction I need to make sure you understand, Bathurst said. The investigation into program methodology and the attribution question are two separate tracks. One is a behavioral and administrative matter. The other is an intellectual property and professional conduct matter. They'll be handled concurrently but not conflated. I understand, she said. The attribution question isn't why I'm here. No, he said. It isn't. But it's going to become part of the record whether you intended it to or not. Another pause. Is the animal still viable? Yes, she said. I ran the first phase recovery protocol this morning. Dr. Strand has the assessment documentation. Good. He sounded like a man writing something down. We'll see you tomorrow, Miss Walgrave. She hung up and sat with the silence for a moment. She had been in this installation for less than 48 hours, and the situation had moved from a facility review to a formal administrative investigation with dispatched investigators. That was faster than she'd expected and slower than Brask's situation required, which meant the next 14 hours were still the critical window. She saved her report draft, backed it up to the MJRO's secure server, and went to find Strand to confirm that the delay documentation was properly filed and that Brask's status was protected overnight. Strand confirmed both. He's listed as under active behavioral review, she said. Nothing can be moved forward without my clearance, and I won't be issuing that clearance until after the investigators complete their intake. Thank you, Fenna said. Don't thank me, Strand said. I've signed 2 termination clearances in the past 8 months that I now need to go back and look at very carefully. She said it the way someone said something they'd been sitting with for a while and had finally decided to say. If what you found in those records is what you say it is, I've been signing off on outcomes that were manufactured. Fenna looked at her. There was nothing comfortable to say to that, so she didn't reach for comfort. The review will establish what the record shows. And if it shows what we both think it shows, then the record shows it, Fenna said, and that changes what happens next. She went back to her quarters and finished the formal submission and sent it at 2100. At 2147, her phone buzzed with a text from Corvell. Tolliver is gone. Didn't come back after the records lock. Vehicle is missing from the lot. She stared at that for a moment. Then she called Greer. Tolliver may have left the installation, she said. I need to know if that's a problem for the investigation. If he's a named subject in a formal administrative review, leaving the installation is documented, Greer said. It doesn't stop anything. It doesn't stop the investigation, Fenna said. But there are files in that records room that he had access to as recently as 3 hours ago. A pause. The physical records are locked. The ones in the system, Fenna said. What about the originals in the old training block? The ones I documented but didn't remove? Silence. Greer. I'll get someone to verify the archive cabinet tonight, Greer said, and his voice had changed in the way that told her he'd just understood what she was asking. Stay available. She stayed available. At 0022, her phone lit with a call from an MJRO number she didn't recognize. She answered, Ms. Walgrave. A different voice, one of the dispatched investigators, she assumed, moving faster than the 0800 arrival window suggested. We've confirmed the storage room documents are intact, all 62 pages. A pause. But when our contact accessed the room, they found something else in that filing cabinet, under your research file. Fenna sat up. What? A separate folder. Handwritten log entries dated across a 14-month period. Names, dates, specific training session records that don't appear in the official system. Another pause. One of the names listed in the first entry is yours. She went very still. Miss Walgrave, these entries appear to document a deliberate process, beginning before your original framework submission was incorporated into the program. The investigator's voice was careful now, precise. We need to speak with you in person. Tonight, if possible. I'll be there, she said. She was already standing. The storage room at midnight looked different than it had at 1400. The same shelving, the same equipment crates, the same low transom windows letting in nothing but the ambient blue of the installation's perimeter lighting. But the filing cabinet in the northwest corner had two MJRO investigators standing beside it, and a portable work light set up on a folding stand, and the shadows it threw were hard and specific in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. The investigator who had called her was a woman named Darce Pelham, mid-40s, compact, with the kind of face that was professionally neutral without being blank. Her partner was a man named Theus, younger, who was photographing the contents of the third cabinet drawer with a document camera while Pelham walked Fenna through what they'd found. The handwritten log was in a manila folder behind Fenna's original research file. 81 pages of entries, dated across 14 months, beginning in late 2012, 6 months before Fenna had formally submitted her framework. "We need you to read through the first section and tell us what you recognize," Pelham said. She had gloves on. She set the folder on the equipment crate they were using as a surface and opened it to the first page. Fenna looked at the handwriting. She didn't recognize it immediately. The entries were written in a compressed utilitarian hand that wasn't distinctive enough to be identifiable on sight. But the content was something else entirely. The first entry described a meeting. A specific meeting in a specific building on a date Fenna remembered because she'd written about it in her own research notes. The 2012 preliminary framework review, where she'd presented the theoretical basis of the graduated arousal recovery model to a small group of program administrators. The log described the meeting from the outside, who presented, what was shown, what the response was, and it described it accurately enough that whoever wrote it had either been in the room or had been briefed by someone who was. The second entry, 12 days later, described a conversation about the framework's commercial and programmatic applications. The third entry referenced a decision to pursue independent development of the recovery model for installation use. Fenna read to the bottom of the third entry and stopped. "Independent development," she said. "Yes," Pelham said. They watched the preliminary presentation, identified the research value, and started a parallel development track. She looked up. "Before I submitted the final framework, before it was formally in any system they could access." "That's our read," Pelham said. "The timeline in the log predates your formal submission by 6 months, and the program's official launch by 14 months. Fenna turned to the next page. The fourth entry had a name at the top. Not a signature, just a name written as a header, as if labeling a contact or a source. The name was Valand, not Colonel Valand, just Valand, which in 2012 meant he had been involved before he held his current command, before the program he now commanded had technically existed. "He was part of the initial decision," Fenna said. "He was part of the initial decision," Pelham confirmed. "We're still establishing his role in the specific entries, but the name appears 11 times across the first 30 pages. Theus looked up from the document camera. "There's a section in the middle, pages 40 through 53, that appears to document the attribution decision specifically. The language is careful, but the meaning is clear enough." He paused. "They decided the framework would be more useful to the program if the originating research wasn't formally connected to an outside consultant." Fenna stood very still for a moment. She had known, in the way you know things before you can prove them, that what had happened to her research wasn't accident or oversight or the kind of attribution drift that happened in collaborative environments. She had known it was a decision. But knowing something and reading the documented record of the meeting where that decision was made were two different experiences, and the second one had a weight the first one didn't. "I need a copy of this," she said. "You'll have a full copy as part of the investigation record," Pelham said. "Tonight we need your verbal confirmation of the elements you recognize, meetings, dates, individuals mentioned." "How long?" 2 hours, maybe 3. Fenna looked at the folder. She thought about Brask and his run on the other side of the installation, settled for the night, not knowing that the paperwork justifying his termination had just become part of an administrative investigation record that was going to land on desks considerably higher than Valen's. "Start at the beginning," she said. It was 0340 when she got back to her quarters. She didn't sleep. She sat at the small desk and wrote out her own account of the meetings and dates she'd confirmed for Pelham, not because the investigators needed it, they had her verbal record, but because she needed the act of writing it down in her own hand, in her own words, to make the shape of what had happened fully real to her after 11 years of knowing it as something she couldn't prove. The log hadn't just documented the theft of her research framework. It had documented the reasoning behind it, the specific, pragmatic, institutional reasoning of people who had looked at her work and her name and her position as an outside civilian consultant and made a calculation. Her name on the framework created a dependency on someone they didn't control. The program was stronger, more fundable, more prestigious, more permanently embedded in the installation's identity, if the methodology appeared to originate from within. So they'd made it originate from within. And for 11 years, the program had run on her framework, had trained handlers using her recovery sequences, had produced the K9 doctrine that every unit in the region cited. And none of that had any connection in any official record to the woman who designed it, until someone started doing it wrong. That was the part that was hardest to sit with, in the 4 hours between midnight and dawn. Not the theft itself, she'd made her peace with that, or thought she had, but the fact that the misapplication had caused real damage to real animals, and the damage had been blamed on the animals, and a dog was alive tonight who wouldn't have been if she hadn't been sent here. She wrote until 05:30, then made coffee on the small drip machine in the corner and stood at the window and watched the installation come into its morning shift. The kennel sounds started up at 0600, the specific register of working dogs, recognizing the shift transition, the brief vocal burst, and then the settling into the rhythm of a day. At 0645, Corvell texted, "Investigators in Valen's office. 2 vehicles from the main gate at 0630. She texted back, "I know. Stay out of it today unless they call you." "They called me at 0620, he replied, scheduled for 0900. She thought about that. Corvell's internal memo, the one that had identified the pattern and been ignored, was going to be central to the investigation record. He had done the right thing through the right channels, and the channels had failed. That mattered, and the investigators would know it mattered. "You'll be fine," she texted. "Tell them exactly what you told me, all of it." She dressed, picked up her folder, and went back to the installation. The investigator's presence changed the texture of the place immediately and completely. It was visible in the way people moved in the corridors, the specific, careful quality of individuals who were aware that what they said and where they went was now being noted in ways it hadn't been 48 hours ago. Some of the handlers in the yard worked their morning sessions with the focused deliberateness of people performing normalcy. Others, she noticed, worked with what looked like genuine relief, the kind that came from months of watching something go wrong and not being able to name it to anyone who could do anything about it. Pelham found her in the K9 medical corridor at 0730 and walked beside her without preamble. "Valen made 3 calls between midnight and 0400 last night," Pelham said. "We have the log from the installation's communication system. 2 of them went to legal. 1 went to an outside number we're still running down." "Tolliver?" Fenna asked. "Possibly. The outside number isn't registered to him directly." Pelham's pace was efficient, covering ground without appearing to hurry. "Valand is cooperating with the intake interview formally, but his legal counsel has indicated he's going to characterize the framework attribution as a collaborative development arrangement. There's a handwritten log documenting the decision to remove my attribution," Fenna said. "He'll argue the log's authorship is unclear and the language is ambiguous." "Is it?" Pelham was quiet for a moment. "The language on pages 40 through 53 is not particularly ambiguous, but establishing authorship of a handwritten document takes time." She paused at the corridor intersection. "The stronger case, for immediate purposes, is the training malpractice. The handler assignment data, the recovery interval documentation, the removal pattern. That's the administrative record, and the administrative record is unambiguous." "And Brask," Fenna said. "Brask's status is protected until the review is complete," Pelham said. "Dr. Strand's delay documentation has been formally entered. Nobody is touching that evaluation without our sign-off." Fenna felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully registered holding. "Good." Pelham stopped walking. "Miss Walgrave, I want to be direct with you about something." "Please." "The investigation is going to establish what the record shows. The training malpractice case is strong, and the administrative consequences for Tolliver and likely for Valand are going to be significant." She held Fenna's gaze. "The attribution case is going to take longer. The handwriting analysis, the timeline corroboration, the formal determination of professional misconduct. That's months. not days. I want you to have a realistic expectation. I know, Fenna said. You came here for the dogs. I came here for the dogs, Fenna said. The rest of it will resolve the way it resolves. Pelham looked at her for a moment, not assessing exactly, more like confirming something she'd already decided. This is pulling Tolliver's location from the vehicle tracker. If he's reachable, we'll bring him in for voluntary questioning today. And if he's not reachable, then he becomes a named subject who removed himself during an active investigation, Pelham said, which is its own kind of answer. She left Fenna at the corridor intersection and went back the way she'd come. Fenna stood there for a moment, then continued toward the veterinary wing. Strand was already in the assessment bay when Fenna arrived. She had Brask on a long lead, working him through a basic environmental familiarization sequence. Nothing demanding, just movement through the space, object introduction, low-level stimulus presentation. The dog was tracking the exercises with the particular engaged attention of an animal that had something useful to do and was discovering that useful things were available to him again. Fenna stood at the observation window and watched. Strand noticed her and finished the sequence before coming to the doorway. He slept, she said. Sable checked him at 0200 and he was down, first solid sleep log in 3 weeks. Fenna looked at the dog. He knows something changed. Animals know when the pressure comes off, Strand said. You don't have to explain it to them. She leaned against the doorframe. Pelham's team came through the vet records at 0700. They pulled the 2 clearances I signed in the past 8 months. I know. The second one, Strand stopped, started again. The dog they euthanized in March. His handler assignment was Tolliver. I went back through the training record this morning. She was quiet for a moment. The recovery interval data looks like Brask's. Fenna didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would make that information better. I signed the clearance, Strand said. The record was presented to me as a complete evaluation. I didn't request the underlying training data. You'll have the opportunity to put that in your formal statement, Fenna said. The fact that the underlying data was not surfaced to you is part of the case. Strand looked at the dog in the bay. It doesn't change what happened to him. No, Fenna agreed. It doesn't. They stood there for a moment with that between them. The thing that couldn't be fixed, sitting alongside the things that still could. I want to run the second phase protocol today, Fenna said. If the investigators clear the access. They've cleared your continued assessment access. It's in the investigation support order. Strand stepped back from the doorway. He's ready. The second phase session ran for 2.5 hours. It was harder than the morning before because second phase work asked more. Longer regulation windows, higher arousal thresholds, novel handler introductions that tested whether the dog could manage his response to unfamiliar people without the tipping over that had been his pattern. Fenna brought Corvell in for the handler introduction component, not because she needed him specifically, but because Brask had already had brief exposure to him in the corridor, and the partial familiarity was useful data. Corvell worked with Brask for 40 minutes under Fenna's direction, and the dog responded the way a dog responded when the thing being asked of him was within his actual capacity. Not easily, not without friction, but without the qualitative difference between working and breaking that had defined every training record in his file for the past 11 months. At one point, Brask pushed back hard on a recall, planting himself and going stiff-legged, and Corvell looked at Fenna for guidance, and she said, "Don't pull. Wait him out." And Corvell waited, and after 90 seconds, the dog broke the stiffness himself and came forward, and Corvell rewarded the recall without drama, and they moved on. "That's the framework," Corvell said quietly during the brief rest interval. "What you just told me to do. That's the sequence in the Iron Ridge Doctrine." "Yes," Fenna said. "Except the doctrine doesn't explain why. It just gives the sequence." "I know," she said. "The reasoning got removed when it was adapted." Corvell looked at her. "Without the reasoning, you can't adapt it when the dog does something unexpected." "That's why it fails under pressure," she said. "The sequence works in the conditions it was designed for. A handler who understands the reasoning can adjust. A handler who just has the sequence hits a wall when the conditions change." She paused. "That's what happened to Tolliver's dogs. He was running the sequence without the architecture underneath it. Could he have known that? That the architecture was missing?" Fenna thought about the handwritten log. about the entries describing the decision to adapt the framework for program use, the meetings, the names. Tolliver knew the program had a methodology. Whether he knew it was incomplete, she stopped. He knew it wasn't working. He kept pushing anyway and blaming the animals. She picked up her assessment notes. That's a separate question from whether he knew where the methodology came from. Pelham came to the assessment bay at 1400 with an update that she delivered in the corridor outside so that the dog wasn't in earshot of voices carrying investigative weight. Tolliver had been located. He'd driven to a motel 40 miles from the installation the previous night and checked in under his own name, which was either confidence or panic depending on how you read it. The investigators had contacted him by phone at 10:30. He had agreed to return to the installation for voluntary questioning at 1600. Voluntary, Fenna said. His word, Pelham said. We didn't compel it. What about Valand? Valand's formal interview concluded at noon. He's been advised not to leave the installation. Pelham checked something on her tablet. He's suspended from command authority for the duration of the investigation, effective as of 1300 today. Acting command transferred to the deputy installation commander. That was faster than Fenna had expected. She didn't let it show. The framework log, she said, the handwriting analysis. We've submitted the document for expedited forensic analysis, Pelham said. Timeline is 5 to 7 business days, but... She paused. We also ran the document metadata on the program's official framework document, the one in the current training doctrine. Fenna waited. The metadata shows the digital document was created in 2015, Pelham said. The program claims the framework was developed from 2013 onward. The digital creation date and the modification history don't align with an organic development process. She looked at Fenna. They align with a document that was adapted from an existing source and then had its revision history manually cleared. Fenna let that settle. They adapted the original digital file. It appears so, which means somewhere in the document's lineage, your original digital submission exists as the parent source. Can you find it? The audit forensics team is working on it now, Pelham said. It's technically recoverable. The question is time. How much time? Days, not weeks, Pelham said. But the installation investigation record doesn't wait for it. The administrative malpractice case is already complete enough for formal findings. She left. Fenna went back into the assessment bay and finished the afternoon session with Brask. And by the end of it, she had written a 12-page behavioral assessment that concluded in clear, specific clinical language that the animal designated Brask, male Belgian Malinois, serial K9 IRK 047, demonstrated active recovery capacity consistent with return to service potential following an appropriate rehabilitation period, and that the behavioral profile documented in his termination evaluation was inconsistent with primary genetic or developmental instability and was instead consistent with stress-induced behavioral dysregulation following extended exposure to escalation without recovery training protocols. She submitted the assessment to Strand at 17:30. Strand read it in 15 minutes and countersigned it. Tolliver arrived at the installation at 15:53, 7 minutes early, which told Fenna something she filed away. A man arriving 7 minutes early to a voluntary questioning that he'd agreed to after spending the night in a motel 40 miles away was a man who had spent the night deciding which version of events served him best and had arrived at an answer. She wasn't in the room when Pelham and Theus interviewed him. She wasn't supposed to be. But she was in the K9 records room, which shared a ventilation run with the interview room 2 corridors over, and while she couldn't make out specific words, she could read the acoustic pattern of the conversation, its rhythm, its pauses, the point at which the register changed. The change happened at the 50-minute mark. Whatever Pelham had put on the table at that point, it altered something. The rhythm that had been structured and even, a man delivering a prepared account, became ragged. Shorter turns, longer pauses. The specific acoustic shape of someone who had just discovered that what they thought was a manageable situation had walls they hadn't seen. The interview ran another 40 minutes after that. Corvell found her in the records room at 1800 and sat down across from her without speaking for a moment. Tolliver went to Valen's office after the interview, he said. Someone on the evening shift saw them in the corridor. Together? They were arguing, Corvell said. In the corridor, not the office. Out in the open where anyone walking by could see it. He paused. Specialist Darrow was walking by. What did Darrow hear? Enough that Darrow went straight to Pelham's team. Fenna set down her pen. What happened? Valen told Tolliver that if the log entries were attributed to him, the handwritten log, that Tolliver had provided the information in those entries. Corvell's jaw was tight. He was telling Tolliver to take the attribution, that the entries were Tolliver's notes, not his. The room was very still. Tolliver didn't agree, Corvell said. That's what Darrow heard. He didn't agree, and Valand... He stopped. Valand told him that he didn't have a choice, that the alternative was losing everything. Fenna looked at the table. She thought about the log entries, the names in the first 30 pages, the specific pragmatic language of a decision made by people who believed they were untouchable enough that writing it down was acceptable. Darrow gave a formal statement, Corvell said. Tonight. I know, she said. She had seen Pelham in the corridor 15 minutes ago, and the investigator's expression had told her something had shifted, though not what. Now she knew what. What happens to Tolliver? Corvell asked. That depends on what he tells Pelham tomorrow, she said. A man who followed a methodology he didn't fully understand and blamed the animals for the result is a different case from a man who participated in the original decision. She paused. We don't know yet which one he is. And if he cooperates? Then the record gets more complete faster, she said. Corvell nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Valen's been here for 4 years. He ran this program like it was his. The commendations, the unit photographs, everything in his office is about this program. He rubbed the side of his face. I don't think he ever thought of it as someone else's work. Fenna looked at him. He knew, she said. The log entries go back to 2012. He was in the room when I presented the preliminary framework. He made the decision to use it and remove my name from it. She paused. You can't know something for 11 years and not know it. Corvell was quiet. He didn't argue the point because there wasn't an argument to make. She packed up her folder and went back to her quarters. She was almost at the entrance to the visitor block when her phone rang. Greer Tandos. I just got off the phone with Bathurst, Greer said. The DoD forensics team found the document lineage. She stopped walking. Already? The original digital framework submission was in the program's own server backup system, Greer said. Not deleted, archived under a non-indexed directory. Either they didn't know it was there or they assumed nobody would look in a 12-year-old backup. A brief pause. It has your name in the metadata, Fenna. Original author field, creation date, the whole chain. She stood outside the visitor block in the evening air and listened to the kennel sounds from the far side of the installation and didn't say anything for a moment. The forensics report goes to Bathurst tomorrow morning, Greer said, with the installation investigation findings, with the behavioral assessment from Strand, with the interview records. And the corridor conversation, she said, Darrow's statement. Pelham briefed Bathurst an hour ago, Greer said. Valen's suspension is being elevated. Bathurst used the word termination in the call, not suspension. Termination. Fenna exhaled slowly. You should know, Greer said, that Tolliver came back to Pelham after the corridor incident, on his own, 2 hours ago. He paused. He provided a supplementary statement. I don't have the full content, but Pelham told Bathurst it was significant. How significant? Significant enough that Bathurst is personally attending the formal findings presentation tomorrow at 1000, Greer said, which he has not done for a facility-level investigation in 6 years. She let that settle. Fenna. Greer's voice was quieter now. Is there anything you need before tomorrow? She thought about the question. She thought about the assessment bay, and the dog who had slept for the first time in 3 weeks, and the 12 pages she had written that morning in clear clinical language that no one was going to be able to set aside. She thought about the handwritten log and the 53rd page and the word Valand appearing 11 times in the first 30 pages of a document that had just been corroborated by a digital forensics chain that went back to the original parent file on a server that had been sitting in the program's own system for 12 years. No, she said, I have everything I need. She went inside. She was almost asleep when the notification came through. Not a call this time, a secure message from the MJRO document system. She opened it because the header indicated formal case status update, and she read it twice because the first time through she wanted to be certain she wasn't misreading the language. She wasn't. Tolliver's supplementary statement had named 3 additional individuals who had been present at the 2012 attribution decision meeting. Not handlers, not program administrators. Senior DoD program officers, two of whom were still in active posts. The investigation that had started as a K9 facility review had just become something considerably larger, and somewhere in that expansion, the woman who had been dismissed as a civilian consultant with a visitor badge had become the originating source of a case that was going to reach places nobody at Harwick had ever intended it to reach. She set down her phone. She looked at the ceiling for a long moment in the dark. And then, in the quiet of the installation night with the distant sound of the kennel and the weight of tomorrow's 1000 presentation and everything that came after it, she felt the specific exhausted clarity of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just, finally, set it down. Not because the work is over, but because the truth no longer needs her to hold it up alone. She slept 4 hours and woke before the alarm. The installation was in that particular pre-dawn register that large facilities have, not quiet, because large facilities are never fully quiet, but subdued in a way that felt provisional, like the world holding its breath before deciding what kind of day to be. She lay there for a few minutes and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill she'd developed slowly and imperfectly over years of working in environments that made thinking about nothing feel like a luxury she hadn't earned. Then she got up and made coffee and sat at the desk and read through her assessment notes one final time. Not because she needed to, she knew them, but because reading her own work in the hour before she had to defend it was a way of reminding herself that the work was real and solid and built on 11 years of documented research that predated everything Valand had constructed his program around. She was ready at 0900. The formal findings presentation was at 1000. She went to see Brask first. Sable was on the early shift in the veterinary wing, and she let Fenna into the assessment bay without requiring explanation. The dog was awake when she came in, sitting near the center of the space with his head up, tracking her from the moment the door opened. Not alarmed, just attentive in the way of an animal that had relearned in the past 48 hours that attentiveness didn't have to cost him anything. Fenna sat down on the rubberized floor cross-legged and let him come to her if he chose. He chose. Not immediately. He wasn't that dog yet, the one who would walk directly to someone and lean in without calculation. He took his time, reading the space, reading her, making the decision through whatever combination of instinct and recent experience guided him now. But he came. He stopped a foot away and held still for a moment and then sat down in front of her, and she put her hand out, palm up, and he sniffed it once and then rested his jaw on her knee with the specific weight of an animal that had decided, provisionally and with full awareness of the risk, to trust. She sat there with him for 20 minutes. She thought about what Corvell had said. He didn't have to be what he became, and about the dog who had been scheduled for termination 4 days ago by a program that had manufactured his failure and then used the failure as cover. She thought about the 2 other dogs whose files Strand was reviewing. She thought about the ones before them, the ones the record might never fully account for. There was a version of this story where none of it was recoverable, where the documentation stayed buried and the program continued and Brask became another data point in a removal rate that Valand would keep calling expected variance until someone else came along and looked at the pattern. That version had been entirely plausible 72 hours ago. It wasn't plausible anymore. She put her free hand on the dog's head briefly and then stood up and left the bay. The formal findings room was in the administrative block, a conference space that had been reconfigured overnight with additional seating and a document display setup that Theus was still adjusting when Fenna arrived at EO 940. Pelham was at the front of the room going over her materials. 2 individuals Fenna hadn't seen before were seated along the side wall, DoD observers, from their bearing and their complete lack of installation insignia. Senior Review Director Olin Bathurst was already there. He was older than his voice had suggested on the phone, somewhere in his late 60s, with the compact, considered presence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where the weight of decisions accumulated. He was looking at the document display when Fenna came in, and he turned when Pelham indicated her arrival. "Ms. Walgrave," he said. He crossed the room and offered his hand. "I've read your assessment documentation and your formal report submission. All of it." "Thank you for coming," she said. "I don't usually attend facility-level proceedings," he said. He said it without elaboration, which was its own elaboration. The room filled over the next 15 minutes. Corvell came in and took a seat near the back. Strand arrived and sat beside the DoD observers. Two handlers Fenna recognized from the training yard filed in. She didn't know if they'd been summoned or had come because word had moved through the installation faster than formal notification. But either way, they were there. Valand was the last to arrive. He came in with legal counsel, a civilian attorney who sat immediately to his left and positioned a notepad on the table with the practiced motion of someone who had done this many times. Valand himself looked like a man who had not slept and was managing the fact of not having slept with the performance of his usual professional composure, which meant the performance was visible as performance in a way it hadn't been earlier in the week. He sat down without looking at Fenna. Tolliver was not present. Pelham had told her that morning that Tolliver had been formally removed from the installation at 0700 pending the outcome of the investigation, which was standard procedure once a supplementary statement implicated additional subjects. He had surrendered his access credentials and left in his own vehicle. Pelham opened the formal presentation at 1003. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she moved through the findings in a sequence that built deliberately. Administrative record first, then the handler assignment data, then the recovery interval documentation, then the pattern analysis, then the timeline. She presented each element with its source citation and its specific relevance to the investigation findings. And she did it with the steady, unflinching register of someone who understood that the power of what she was presenting came from the facts themselves and needed no amplification. At the 20-minute mark, she presented the framework document timeline, the original submission date, the program launch date, the digital metadata from the current doctrine file, the forensic recovery of the parent document from the server backup. She put them on the display side by side, dates and author fields visible, the chain of custody labeled at each step. Valand's attorney made one objection during this section. Pelham noted it, acknowledged it was in the record, and continued without modifying the presentation. At the 40-minute mark, she presented the handwritten log. Not all 81 pages. She summarized the timeline and the content of the attribution decision entries, and she read 3 specific passages directly because they were precise enough that summarizing them would have softened something that needed to remain sharp. The room was very quiet during the reading. At the 55-minute mark, she presented Darrow's statement about the corridor conversation. She presented it without commentary. The content was sufficient. Then she turned to Fenna and said, "Miss Walgrave, you've provided a formal behavioral assessment of the animal designated Brask, K9 IRK047. I'd like you to summarize your findings for the record." Fenna stood. She had been in many rooms like this one, and she had learned in each of them that the moment of standing up was always harder than what came after. Not because of the room was just a room, but because standing up in it meant committing, fully and publicly, to the version of events that had her name on the cover page and 11 years of documented evidence behind it. Rooms like this one had a way of making that commitment feel heavier than it actually was, and the weight was something she'd learned to carry without letting it alter her posture. She spoke for 8 minutes. She described Brask's clinical presentation on initial assessment, his response to the graduated recovery protocol, the 2 pushback incidents she'd documented and what they indicated, and the second phase session results with Corvell as the introduced handler. She described the behavioral profile as it appeared in his termination evaluation versus what the assessment data showed, and she used precise clinical language throughout without softening the complexity of what the data said. Recovery was possible and supported by the evidence. Return to service was a realistic outcome with appropriate rehabilitation. The termination order was not clinically justified. Then she stopped and sat down. Bathurst asked 2 questions, both specific, both about the recovery protocol design, both indicating he had read her original framework document in more detail than she'd expected. She answered them directly. Valand's attorney asked 1 question, whether the behavioral assessment had been conducted under formal MJRO authorization or under veterinary authority. Fenna said both and cited the documentation for each. The attorney wrote something on his notepad and didn't ask anything else. The formal findings were issued at 12:15. Pelham read them aloud, which was procedurally standard and practically significant because reading them aloud in a room with witnesses made them part of a shared event rather than a document that could be characterized later as something other than what it was. The findings on training malpractice were unambiguous. Senior Sergeant Mac Tolliver had systematically applied escalation protocols without adequate recovery intervals across a 14-month period, resulting in 11 documented cases of stress-induced behavioral dysregulation in military working K9s that were incorrectly attributed to primary animal instability. The findings recommended formal administrative action, reassignment from K9 handling duties, and review of all evaluations conducted under Tolliver's authority during the relevant period. The findings on command responsibility were equally unambiguous. Colonel Harlan Valand had received an internal memo identifying the removal pattern 6 months prior to the formal investigation and had taken no corrective action. He had subsequently taken active steps to restrict investigator access to relevant documentation and had pressured a named subject in an active investigation to assume attribution for documentary evidence. The findings recommended suspension of command authority pending a formal conduct review and referral to the DoD Inspector General's office for investigation of the broader attribution matter, including the named senior officers in Tolliver's supplementary statement. The findings on the framework attribution stated clearly that the research basis of the Iron Ridge K9 behavioral recovery framework had been established through forensic analysis to originate in a formal submission by civilian consultant Fenna Walgrave dated 2013, predating the program's claimed development timeline by 3 years, and that the process by which her attribution had been removed from the official program documentation constituted professional misconduct requiring formal remedy. The findings recommended the official correction of the program's documentation to restore original authorship attribution, formal notification to all installations using the framework, and a review of any professional or financial recognition that had accrued to named individuals based on the framework during the intervening period. Pelham finished reading. The room held the particular silence of a place where something significant has just been stated publicly for the first time, and the air hasn't caught up yet. Valand's attorney was already writing. Valand himself sat with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who had been preparing for a version of this and was now discovering that the actual version was larger than his preparation. He didn't look at Fenna. She didn't wait for him to. Bathurst stood after a moment and addressed the room briefly, thanking the investigators, noting the ongoing nature of the broader inquiry, acknowledging Dr. Strand's role in protecting the immediate welfare of the animal under review. He spoke for 4 minutes, and then he turned to Fenna. "Miss Walgrave," he said, "the review office owes you a debt that the formal findings don't fully account for. You came here to do a job, and you did it in conditions that were designed to prevent you from succeeding. I want that on the record." She looked at him. "I came here for the dogs," she said. "Everything else followed from that." "Yes," he said. "It did." He left the room with the DoD observers. Valand left 90 seconds later with his attorney, and she noticed as he went that the commendations on his wall, the ones she'd seen arranged at precise intervals when she first sat across from him 3 days ago, were going to mean something different now. Not nothing. They represented real work done over a real career, but not the specific thing they had been arranged to mean, which was a man who had built something from the ground up. He hadn't built it from the ground up. He had looked at what someone else built and decided to put his name on it, and that decision had contaminated everything that came after it, all the way down to a dog in a concrete run waiting to die for problems a corrupted methodology had created. Fenna watched him go and felt something that wasn't triumph. It was smaller and more complicated than triumph, closer to the particular sad relief of a thing being finally, correctly named. Corvell was waiting for her in the corridor. He looked like a man who had just watched something he'd spent months trying to address finally get addressed. And the relief was real, but it was also mixed with the specific weight of having been the person in the room who flagged the problem and was not heard. "The memo," he said. 6 months. "It's in the record," she said. "The findings specifically note that command received notification and took no action. That protects you in the conduct review." He nodded. He didn't look entirely comforted, because being protected in a conduct review was not the same as not having spent 6 months watching good dogs get labeled damaged, while the person responsible kept being decorated. "Brask," he said. "The termination order is formally withdrawn as of the findings," she said. "Strand will issue the return to rehabilitation status this afternoon." He exhaled. "How long for the full rehabilitation?" 6 to 8 weeks if it goes well," she said. "Could be longer. There's no guarantee on the timeline. But possible. Yes, she said. Possible. He looked at her for a moment. What happens to you now, after this? She had been thinking about that question at intervals for the past 36 hours. I finish my contract with the MJRO, she said. Submit the complete formal report. Go back to Calder City. And the nursing? The nursing was always the plan, she said. The rest of it? She paused. I didn't come here to reclaim anything. I came here because someone needed to look at the pattern, and I was the person with the relevant background. You were the person who built the background, he said. She didn't argue it. Either way, he looked at the corridor ahead. The framework, now that it's officially attributed, does that change how it gets used? It changes who gets credited for it, she said. Whether it changes how it gets used depends on whether the people using it go back and read the original. Will they? Some of them, she said. The ones who were running it and hitting walls they didn't understand. They'll want to know why. The reasoning is in the original document, she paused. That's the part that was stripped out. Not just the name. The explanation of why the sequence works, what it's built on, what to do when the conditions change. She looked at him. A methodology without its reasoning is just a procedure, and a procedure fails the moment the situation falls outside the parameters it was written for. Corvell was quiet for a moment. Is that what you'll tell them? If they come to you? If they come to me, she said. He offered his hand. She shook it. His grip was the kind that meant something without performing it. She went to find Strand. The formal paperwork for Brask's status change took 2 hours to process, and Strand signed it at 14:30 with the focused attention of someone who was signing something they needed to sign correctly and completely. When she was done, she set down the pen and looked at the document. The two from March, she said. She didn't need to say more than that. The investigation will review all cases under Tolliver's assignment during the period, Fenna said. What the review finds about the March cases will be in the record. That's not the same as undoing them. No, Fenna said. It isn't. Strand looked at her directly. I'm going to request access to the original framework document, the full version, with the reasoning sections. She said it like a decision she'd already made and was informing Fenna of, not asking permission. My clinical protocol for behavioral assessment clearances needs to be updated. I want to understand what I was working from and where the gaps were. I'll send you the document, Fenna said. Tonight. Strand nodded once and went back to her work. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the old training block, not searching for anything. The cabinet had already been fully documented by the investigators, and the contents were now part of the formal evidence record. She went back because she wanted to stand in the room where the original framework had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 11 years and think about what that meant. Not about the injustice of it, which she'd already processed in as much depth as was useful. About the fact of it. The document had been there, in a room nobody accessed, in a cabinet nobody opened, available, in principle, to anyone with a key and a reason, and nobody had come with both until she did. There was something that felt almost too neat about that, and she didn't trust neat, so she stood with it until the neatness fell away, and what she was left with was something more uncomfortable and more true. The document had been there because it hadn't mattered to the people who took her work, that the evidence of what they'd done existed somewhere. It hadn't mattered because they'd calculated correctly that the distance between evidence existing and evidence being used was large enough to be functionally infinite. They'd been right about that for 11 years. What they'd been wrong about was that the calculation would hold forever, that the gap would always be too wide to cross, that the kind of person who would come in here with a visitor badge and a medical folder and an 11-year-old knowledge of why the dogs were failing would never actually show up. She left the old training block and locked the door behind her. The last thing she did on the installation was run the morning assessment with Brask one final time. Not because it was scheduled. The rehabilitation plan she'd designed would be run by Corvell and Strand going forward, and she'd written it out in enough detail that they could execute it without her. She went because she wanted to see him one more time in a context where what she saw was what the assessment data said and not what the termination record had tried to make permanent. I was eating when she arrived. That was itself a clinical data point. Appetite suppression was one of the first markers of stress dysregulation, and he'd barely touched food for the first 2 days she was on the installation. Sable reported he'd finished his full ration at both feeding times the day before. He looked up from the bowl when she came in and went back to eating, which was exactly right. She wasn't a threat, and she wasn't a stimulus to respond to, and he knew it. He was just a dog eating his breakfast, which was a sentence that had not been available to describe him 4 days ago. She ran a short 20-minute session, low demand, reinforcement focused, nothing that asked more of him than what he'd already proven he could give. He worked through it with the kind of steadiness that was different from compliance. Compliance looked the same on the surface, but had a quality of bracing underneath it. What Brask was doing now was choosing. Not always, not yet. There were still moments of hesitation, and one point where he went flat-eared and she backed the sequence off and rebuilt from lower ground. But the choosing was there, more and more, and the choosing was the whole point of the framework she'd spent 6 years building. You couldn't force a working dog to want to work. You could compel behaviors, and the behaviors would look functional until the conditions exceeded the compliance. And then you'd have a dog labeled unrecoverable in a concrete run with a termination order attached to his file. What you could do, what took time and patience and an understanding of why the sequence worked and not just what the sequence was build the conditions where the dog chose, where the dog found the working relationship genuinely rewarding rather than merely unavoidable, where the dog checked in with you because checking in had been worth it every time before. That was the framework. That was the 11 years of research she'd reduced to a training doctrine that someone had looked at and decided was more useful with her name removed. She gave Brask the final release command, and he shook himself and went to his water bowl, and she sat in the corner of the assessment bay and wrote the last entry in her assessment log, and then she was done. What? She drove out through the main gate at 1400. The guard at the checkpoint was the same young man who had barely looked at her credentials when she drove in, and this time he actually looked at her ID before handing it back, which she registered without attaching meaning to it. People looked at her credentials more carefully now. That would be the pattern for a while, she suspected. The specific kind of increased attention that came from a name moving through institutional channels in a way that made people curious about who the name belonged to. She drove for 40 minutes before she stopped at a roadside diner outside a town called Pell's Crossing and ate a meal she actually tasted, which was the first one in 4 days that qualified. The diner had the specific worn, comfortable quality of a place that had been the same for 20 years and was not going to change. And she sat in a booth by the window and ate eggs and toast and drank 2 cups of coffee and looked at the highway and didn't think about anything in particular. Her phone buzzed twice during the meal. She checked it once. Greer, confirming the formal report submission deadline had been extended to give her time to incorporate the investigation findings. She texted back that she'd have it in before the extension was necessary. She put the phone face down and finished eating. The weeks that followed had the specific texture of things resolving in real time rather than all at once. The DoD. Inspector General's office opened its formal inquiry into the attribution matter within 10 days of the installation findings. The 2 senior program officers named in Tolliver's supplementary statement were placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks of that, pending the inquiry outcome. Their names went into a record that would take months to fully process, but was already, in its existence, a different reality than the one that had existed before Fenna drove through the Harwick Gate. Tolliver was formally separated from K9 handling duties and referred for a conduct review board. His handler assignments across the full installation period were being reviewed case by case. It was slow work. Some of the cases would be recoverable in the record, some wouldn't. The ones that weren't sat in the record as the specific cost of a methodology applied without its foundational reasoning by someone who understood compliance and had never thought to wonder about the difference between compliance and choice. Valen's termination was finalized 3 weeks after the formal findings. His attorney filed 2 procedural objections. Both were acknowledged and denied. His commendations remained on the institutional record because commendations reflected actions taken, and some of what he had done over 20-plus years of service was real, regardless of what else was true about him. The program he'd built his identity around was now officially attributed to someone else, and whatever he did with that, whatever room he sat in on whatever morning and thought about it, was his to live with. Fenna didn't spend time thinking about what he felt. The formal attribution correction was issued by the DoD 6 weeks after the findings, and it was more complete than she'd expected. Not just a notation in the program documentation, but a formal bulletin issued to every installation using the framework, stating clearly that the Iron Ridge K9 Behavioral Recovery Framework was derived from research conducted and formally submitted by civilian behavioral specialist Fenna Walgrave in 2013, and directing all program administrators to ensure the original documentation was available alongside the current training doctrine. Greer called her when the bulletin went out. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about that honestly for a moment. "Like a correction," she said. "That's what it is. It's more than a correction. It's a correction that took 11 years, she said. "I'm glad it happened. I'm not going to pretend it didn't take 11 years. "Fair," he said. "The original document has the reasoning sections intact," she said. "That's the part I actually care about. If handlers can read why the sequence works and not just what the sequence is, that changes how they use it when the situation falls outside the parameters." She paused. "That's what the framework was for, not the attribution, what the attribution enables." Greer was quiet for a moment. "You should think about coming back to the MJRO full-time," he said. "Not consulting, a formal role." "I'll think about it," she said. She meant it, which was more than she'd meant it the 3 previous times he'd suggested something similar. Brass completed his rehabilitation in 7 weeks. Not 6, not 8, 7, which was exactly the kind of outcome that didn't fit a narrative about smooth and inevitable progress, but fit the actual reality of a dog that had been pushed past his limits and was rebuilding something genuine rather than performing something convenient. There were 2 setbacks during the 7 weeks. One significant enough that Corvell called her on a Tuesday evening, sounding genuinely uncertain about the trajectory, and she talked him through the adjustment to the protocol, and they tried it the following day, and it worked. The return to service evaluation was passed on the 2nd attempt. The first attempt, he'd clipped the barrier on the final obstacle sequence and had to be rescheduled, and Corvell had called her about that too, and she had told him that a dog who clips a barrier on a rescheduled evaluation is a dog who is working within the system rather than being broken by it, and that was the only result she'd actually needed to see. The 2nd attempt he ran clean. Strand signed the return to service clearance and sent Fenna a message that said simply, "He passed." Ms. Fenna was in Calder City when the message came, back in her regular rotation at the medical center, 2 days into a 12-hour shift that had already included a trauma case and a pediatric assessment and a 40-minute argument with the department administrator about supply allocation. She read the message standing in the corridor outside the supply room and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name because naming it would have required stopping, and she still had 6 hours left in the shift. She put her phone away and went back to work. 3 months after the installation findings, the MJRO hosted a formal K9 program review conference at a neutral facility in the city of Harkin, 200 miles from Harwick. Representatives from 14 installations attended. The agenda included a review of K9 training methodology standards, a presentation on the behavioral assessment protocol, and a session on recovery interval science. Fenna was asked to present the last session. She almost declined. Not because she didn't want to present the material. The material was hers, and she knew it better than anyone in the room would. But because presenting it in a room full of handlers and program administrators who had spent years training from a framework that carried someone else's name on it was a different experience from writing it. And she needed to be certain she could do that without the experience of the past 3 months weighing on every sentence. She decided she could. She stood at the front of the room with her notes on the lectern and looked at the 37 people in the seats. Handlers, administrators, veterinary officers, 2 program directors, and she started not at the beginning of the research, but in the middle of it, with the specific problem she'd been trying to solve when she first designed the recovery framework. The problem was simple, and the solution was not. Working K9s were being trained to escalate without being taught to come back. The escalation was the visible, measurable, fundable part of the work. The recovery was invisible until it failed. And when it failed, the failure was attributed to the animal. She talked for 45 minutes without notes after the first 5. She talked about what arousal looked like physiologically, what recovery required, what happened to an animal's nervous system when escalation was repeated without genuine downtime, why the sequence in the doctrine was designed in that specific order, and what broke down when steps were shortened or removed. She talked about Brask without using his designation. She described his case as a case with clinical specificity, and the room understood what they were hearing. She talked about the difference between compliance and engagement and why it mattered when the situation exceeded the training parameters. At the end, she stopped and looked at the room for a moment. "The framework in your current doctrine works," she said. "It works because the sequence is built on a real understanding of how these animals regulate stress. If you follow it completely and you understand why each step exists, you will get results that hold under pressure." She paused. "The cases where it failed, and you know the ones I'm referring to, failed not because the methodology was wrong, but because it was used as a procedure without the reasoning behind it. A procedure you can follow without understanding. A methodology you can only apply correctly if you know what you're building toward." She let that settle. "These animals work with us because we've given them a reason to," she said. "Not through force, through consistency, through earning it. The moment we treat the earning as optional is the moment we start manufacturing the failures we then blame on them." She looked at the room. "That's what the framework is actually for, not the sequence, the understanding behind the sequence." The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then a handler in the third row, a young woman Fenna didn't know, with the alert and slightly exhausted look of someone in the first year of serious K9 work, raised her hand and asked, "How do you know when a dog is choosing versus complying?" Fenna looked at her. It was a good question. It was the question. "Watch what they do when you don't tell them anything," she said, "when there's no command and no consequence and no stimulus to respond to. What does the dog do with that space?" She paused. "A dog that looks at you in that space. Not because it's been trained to check in, but because checking in has been worth it often enough that it's become the default. That dog is choosing." She paused again. "Build toward that. It takes longer than compliance. It's harder to measure. And it's the only thing that holds when everything else breaks down." The young handler wrote something down. Fenna collected her notes and stepped back from the lectern. Important. On the drive back from Harkin, she stopped at the same roadside diner outside Pell's Crossing where she'd eaten eggs and toast on the day she left Harwick. Same booth by the window. Same worn, comfortable quality of a place that didn't feel the need to be anything other than what it was. She ordered coffee and sat with it and looked at the highway in the late afternoon light. She thought about the 11 years, not with bitterness. She'd worked through the shape of the bitterness in the hours in that Harwick storage room and the long morning after the midnight call, and what she'd come out with on the other side wasn't absence of feeling, but something more like accurate accounting. 11 years of her work being used correctly and incorrectly and incompletely by people who didn't know or didn't care that the reasoning behind the sequence was the whole point. 11 years of animals being trained by a system that was better than what it was doing with it. 11 years of a name being absent from something that bore its DNA in every sequence. That was what had happened. And what had also happened, in the same 11 years, was that she had become a nurse. She had worked 1,000 shifts and learned a different set of skills for reading what wasn't being said and responding to what was actually needed. She had learned that the instinct she'd built in behavioral research, the capacity for patient, precise observation of systems under stress, translated into the medical environment in ways she hadn't anticipated when she went back to school. She had become two things at once, and the two things had shown up together in a military installation that needed both of them. She didn't believe that was neat. She didn't believe it was meant. She believed it was what it was, a set of circumstances that had converged at a particular moment, and the question was only ever what you did with the convergence. She had done what she could with it. That was enough. Not because she'd resolved everything. The DoD inquiry was ongoing. The full scope of what Valand and the named officers had enabled was still being mapped. The dogs who hadn't made it back from Tolliver's care were still part of a record that the record couldn't fully repair. Enough not because perfect, but because real. Because the framework was correctly attributed now. Because Brask was running patrol routes with a handler who understood why the sequence worked. Because a room of 37 handlers had heard the reasoning that had been stripped out of the doctrine they'd been training from, and some of them would use it, and the ones who used it would produce different outcomes, and the different outcomes would show up in the record. That was how things actually changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. In accumulations of small, accurate understandings held by individuals who used them correctly. She finished her coffee. The highway outside the window was catching the last of the afternoon light. The kind of light that turned ordinary things briefly specific, briefly worth looking at before the day moved on to whatever came next. She thought about the young handler in the third row and her question about choosing versus complying. She thought about Brask checking in with Corvell across a training yard because checking in had become worth it. She thought about the 45 minutes she'd stood at the lectern and talked about things she'd spent 6 years understanding, and the way the room had been quiet, not because the material was inaccessible, but because it was landing, and some of what was landing would stay. She left a tip on the table and picked up her folder and went back to her car. There was a shift starting in Calder City in 11 hours, and she was the person scheduled to work it. And the work was real, and it was hers, and nobody was going to take it from her. And that was not a small thing. It had never been a small thing. The most dangerous kind of strength isn't the kind that announces itself. It's the kind that shows up quietly, does what needs doing, and doesn't require permission to be real. The world has a way of underestimating that kind of strength precisely because it doesn't perform itself. And the underestimation is always eventually corrected. Not always in time, not always completely, but corrected. Fenna Walgrave drove back toward the city with the windows down and the folder on the passenger seat, and the particular feeling of a person who has done what they came to do. Not a feeling of triumph, not relief exactly, but the honest, imperfect satisfaction of someone who looked at a thing that was wrong and did not look away, and kept going until it was less wrong than before. That was what she had. It was enough to drive on.